And so certainly, as Professor Larimer said a minute ago, we want people to trust the integrity of elections. We absolutely want that as a standard. I suppose, just the concerns are sort of twofold, with kind of the laws nationwide, and they all, largely it's kind of these restrictions on drop boxes and who can turn in an absentee ballot and things of that nature. The couple concerns I think that those would raise, one is just that convenience factor and the confusion factor. So are we doing things that impede people's ballot access? And as Auditor Veter was describing the Iowa bills, on the one hand, those windows are still pretty big. You certainly have a lot of time to turn a ballot back in. On the other hand, some of these changes, it's not entirely clear to me what difference that makes one way or the other in terms of actual stamping out fraud. I don't know that there's extra fraud more days out from the election or anything like that. I've certainly never seen any documentation of anything that looks like that. The other concern, of course, would be, potentially fairness in applications. Are these applied equally to all people, or are they deployed in a partisan manner? Again, on the face, these are bills that are neutral in a partisan fashion, but it does raise concerns, and I'll be interested to hear, and I already kind of know what Professor Larimer is going to say a little bit about the literature on, absentee ballots, but certainly, we want to make sure that these are things that are applied in fair ways and not to partisan advantage, one way or the other. With that, I think we'll go on to kind of some additional statements here. I think on the agenda here, Therese, you're up next. If you could kind of speak to how these changes impact how the league does its work. Obviously, there are changes here about registration and absentee ballots, and that's something that you guys are involved with. So I turn it over to you.
Evening about the important changes in the voting laws that go into effect this year. As the moderator said, my name is Therese Grant, and I'm currently the president of the League of Women Voters of Iowa. As many of you know, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. Since its establishment in 1920, the League has been promoting free and fair elections for not just women, but for everyone. We are also an organization that advocates for issues, those that affect women and all citizens. When the League was established, like I said, about 100 years ago, some of the earliest efforts of the League of Women Voters were to insist on equal pay for women and child welfare. These issues and many more are things that we're still working on today. Our mission statement is empowering voters, defending democracy. And in our efforts to promote participating in the fundamental rights of voting, the League regularly registers voters. Our local leagues will register voters at special events, on college campuses, in high schools, farmers markets, naturalization ceremonies, and a variety of other places. We host candidate forums so that the voters can educate themselves on what the candidates stand for. We also try to help voters and inform them on when and where to vote. The League is active across the state, ensuring that people have the necessary access and the information to vote. The act of voting is such a fundamental right of citizens, and the League opposes any restrictions in the voting process. So thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll get an opening statement from Amy Campbell, who is the League's Iowa lobbyist.
Hi. Well, thanks everybody for. The content isn't available. I'm getting some feedback. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Amy Campbell, and I am the League lobbyist. I have been lobbying for the last 30 years up at the state capitol and have had the privilege of working with the League for the last 15 or so years. And I have, this year was quite an interesting, this bill was quite interesting from my perspective because in unusual pattern, it passed in just over a week. So the speed in which this bill and the changes were made was unprecedented in my 30 years up there. It went from being introduced to being sent to the governor in just 5 working days. So there wasn't a lot of time for a lot of citizen discussion about it. We were really told that the bill was drafted as it was going to pass and not many changes were going to be made. So we had a lot of opportunities to speak, but not a lot of opportunity to actually have the changes that needed to be made to make it a workable bill. It was really interesting in hearing the legislators and the reasons that they gave for doing these bills. The Republicans in general wanted to see this bill pass because they felt it increased transparency and accountability in our elections. It gave Iowans the confidence in those. On the floor during debate, there was a lot of discussion about what happened in Florida and Georgia and Philadelphia, and not a lot about what happened in Iowa, which is concerning because the league's always taken a very fact-based approach to public policy change. We don't just jump into issues because somebody reported on something in another part of the country. The league does a lot of intensive review of the issue and the facts surrounding the issue before they make a position statement. And so the fact that a lot of these changes were made based on, well, you can call it the big lie. That is what Senator Bisignano said on the floor, that what they were doing was all based on the premise of a lie, the big lie and the rigged election discussion. Senator Carlin actually said that all of the national voting rights bills were designed to facilitate fraud and that Iowa needed the strong rules. So I would encourage anybody on tonight's panel or that are listening to the panel to go and actually watch the debate. It was quite a lively debate in the Senate, and you get a real feel for where all of the parties are feeling in that. That said, this has been a buildup since 2011. There has been a voting bill introduced to do many of these things since 2011, and it really kicked off when the Senate Republicans took control and then were able to start getting some of these bills passed. So I know there was a lot of discussion about this maybe coming from a national organization who took credit for it. And but really, when you look back in the history of it, since 2011, there has been an election bill introduced. So I'm happy to be on this panel tonight, Sherry and everyone. Thank you so much for doing it. I think this is a really important issue.
Thank you, Amy. Next, Grant Veeder, BlackHawk County Auditor, if you'd like to make your opening statement.
Thanks, Justin. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. I'm another UNI graduate, and I've been county auditor in BlackHawk County since 1989. Now, when this bill passed and when Senate File 568, which had more election legislation, passed, the Iowa State Association of County Auditors put a lot of effort into summarizing and explaining this large body of election law changes. And we approached it from 2 different directions. There's quite a bit in the bill that pertains to county auditor duties, and it's not really stuff that is of direct concern to voters on a daily basis, but it's stuff that auditors really need to know. So we put together a document for county auditors. It was about 12 pages long, and then we put together a document for voters. It's about 2 pages long. So we find it, very important to educate both the county auditors and the voters in the state on all these changes. And tonight we're going to focus on changes that affect voters. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Next up is Shelley Wolf, who's the Bremer County Auditor.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. I don't know why it doesn't unmute for me very easily. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to share this information with our voters, to get the information out so that nobody misses the opportunity to vote, being there were changes. I am the Bremer County Auditor, and I have been since the spring of 2010. And I remember the time when our legislative liaisons used to come back and report to our group and tell us that the legislature had absolutely no interest in hearing any of our proposed legislative changes, and how that has changed. And Amy, I don't know how, being 35 years old, you could have been lobbying for 30 years. What we do and what my goal is in the office is to provide clean, neutral elections. It's a high priority to address perspective, trying to make sure that everybody, we meet everybody where they're at and try to help them to understand what we're doing and what we're not hiding. And I mean, it's a struggle after an election to do an audit, but I love that we're doing audits that the Secretary of State asks us to do, because we can show everybody, here's what the machine read off of a random precinct that nobody had any idea we were going to be audited on. And we have a group of people come in. We've been using one of our Board of Supervisors, which has been just wonderful, to have him turn around and share with everybody that he's seen it firsthand, that we've got those paper ballots and we can prove, that what we've done matches those machines. Nobody's touched the machines. They haven't been hacked into. So the audits have been really good. Like I said earlier too, it's our goal to make sure nobody misses the opportunity to vote. And one of the law changes a few years back shortened the window from when we can mail ballots out, shortened it by a week. And that's been a bit of a struggle. I feel like we miss people once in a while with that. But some things in the bill we had been lobbying for years. So we got one or two good things in there that we actually wanted and needed. So that was the good things about the bill. It just came with a lot more than just that. So that's all for now. I'll share the rest when we get more into depth with everything.
All right, thank you very much. And finally, Chris. Chris, who's a professor, Larimer is a professor at UNI in the political science department.
Great, thanks, Justin. Good to see you, and thanks, Sherry, for the invitation to be on this panel. I really appreciate it. And good evening to everyone on the panel and everybody watching. So, as Justin mentioned, I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science at UNI, and a big part of my research is studying voter turnout and doing that in a way that uses field experiments to try to get a better understanding of what type of messages are likely to affect someone's probability of turning out to vote. With any change in election law, there's a concern about what it does in terms of the perception of the security of the process, a perception of the convenience of the process of voting. And I know Grant's going to speak to the details of the changes in the Iowa law, but a lot of the research will tell you that the #1 predictor of voter turnout is past voter turnout. Has someone voted in the past? And part of that process of your initial vote is being registered to vote. And so anytime there's a change to how the registration process works, there's a concern about how that's going to affect someone's initial probability of voting and then their probability of being a long-term voter, voting over an extended period of time. So, I come at this from very much a data-oriented view. What do the data tell us about the changes in any election law in terms of someone's probability of voting? And if there are concerns raised about the security of voting, we know from research that affects someone's attitudes or their own concerns about whether or not there is security surrounding the ballot. If there are perceptions that the convenience of voting has been changed, there's a concern that that's going to affect someone's probability of voting. And as we move through the panel tonight, I'd be happy to talk about some new research that centers on voting by mail and absentee voting, because one of the issues with absentee voting or vote by mail is that it potentially benefits one side or the other. And the research is actually kind of mixed on that. And part of that is that there's what's called a substitution effect, that if you make voting by mail easier, that actually changes someone's process of voting from voting in person to voting by mail. But the overall message, I guess I wanted to, in this opening statement, is just to try to come at this from a data-centered point of view. What do the data tell us about how perceptions of voting change when you have changes in voting laws, and what can we expect if there's more or less emphasis on absentee or mail-in voting? So thank you.
All right, thank you, Chris. So now we're going to turn it over to Grant, and he's going to give us a summary of the sort of relevant changes to Iowa law, and then I'll give a little bit of response to that, and then we'll kind of get responses from other panelists as well. So go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to hit the high points here of the laws that affect voters. First thing that I'll touch on is when the polls close on election day. To this point in Iowa law, primary and general elections were open at the polls from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. All other elections ended at 8 p.m. The law has changed now so that all elections will end at 8 p.m. So primary and general elections will be 1 hour shorter at the polls. In terms of voter registration, the main change affecting voters is that until now, you could register to vote 11 days before the election, 10 days for a general election, and your name would be on the voter roster when you went to the polls. And that's now changed to 15 days. You need to register 15 days before the election if you want to show up on the voter roster. Now, that's not the end of the story there, because people can register to vote on election day. That has not changed. But if you are on the roster prior to the election, then when you get to the polls, you only have to show a photo ID. If you are not on the roster and you're registering to vote that day, then you have to show proof of identity and proof of residence. And the law is kind of specific about what you can use for proof of residence. Then in the area of absentee voting, where I think the most impactful changes are, the first day that you can request an absentee ballot is 70 days before the election. That was changed from 120 days before the election. So a significant change there. The first day that county auditors may mail absentee ballots to voters is now 20 days before the election. It was previously 29 days. And right along with that is voting in person, either at the auditor's office or a satellite location. Previously, that could begin, either of those could begin 29 days before the election. That's changed to 20 days before the election. And if people are requesting absentee ballots by mail, they have to get the request form in our office 15 days before the election. That used to be 11 days for all elections except generals, and it was 10 days for generals. So there's an exception to that for people that are admitted to healthcare facilities, dementia-specific assisted living programs, or a hospital. Those people can request a ballot by telephone no later than 4 o'clock on election day. Then another really big important change that people need to know about is when we can receive absentee ballots for counting. I beg your pardon. It used to be that if your ballot was postmarked the day before the election or earlier, then we would count that ballot as long as we received it before the ballot or before the election was certified at the canvass by the Board of Supervisors, which is a week after the election. Now all ballots have to be received in our office by the close of the polls on election day, 8 p.m. in order to count. We will not count any ballots received after that. Then another important change is on who may return absentee ballots to the auditor's office. It can only be the voter, him or herself, someone living in the voter's household, an immediate family member, people sent by our office, and that's it, except there's a special situation in the law for voters that have blindness or other disabilities. They may use what is called a delivery agent. And then there is some very specific language in the law of what a delivery agent is, what they may be and what they may not be. It has to be an Iowa registered voter. It cannot be the voter's employer or an agent of the employer, an officer or agent of the voters' union, an actual or implied agent for a political party, candidate, or committee. And this this delivery agent may only return 2 ballots per election as a delivery agent. And they must deliver the ballot in person to the county auditor's office. They can't put it in the mail. They can't put it in a drop box. They have to provide the county auditor with identification, the same as would be required at the polls. And they have to sign a statement where they're swearing that they're upholding the law and so forth. So I want to emphasize here, this delivery agent is only for people with disabilities. Everybody else that they can choose among someone living in their household or an immediate family member. And I guess I just want to make sure that people understand this delivery agent is just for people with disabilities, and we don't want any more confusion about that than we have to have. So those are the high points, and there are other things that we might get into later.
Thank you, Grant. So I've been asked to provide sort of a little bit of context for kind of the Iowa laws, and I thought that I would actually start maybe well before this a little bit, because as I sort of listen to these comments, one of the things that's really striking to me is how much we've changed in the last 30 years or so, how we conduct elections. The motor voter bill in particular really not radicalized, but it radically changed, how we do registration, who's allowed to do registration, et cetera. And certainly in the period after that, we've seen almost every state sort of relax the requirements for absentee ballots. I remember years ago, you had to certify that there was absolutely no way you could be there, and there were very limited set of circumstances. And kind of to something Professor Larimer said a minute ago, the voter substitution, that's been my experience. I'm certainly somebody that would vote in person, pretty much every time, but the convenience of my dining room table has really sort of offset that, in my own behavior. What we're starting to see now, and especially kind of in the wake of 2020, is a number of states, 17 to date, that have essentially tried to place further restrictions on some of those changes going forward. And as Mr. Veeder emphasized, there are a lot of these centered around changes to absentee rules. That, especially in the context of the pandemic, was a major thing. Oddly enough, when there's a viral disease going around, people are a little hesitant to go and stand in line with a bunch of strangers in a church basement and, share air. So certainly the 2020 election, really these absentee ballots came to the forefront. And one thing that was, I think, notable just in kind of election night is how different the procedures were from state to state in terms of when those ballots get counted and things of that nature. Certainly, I think a lot of confusion that came up in the 2020 results were laws in Wisconsin and in Georgia that basically greatly delayed when they could start counting the ballots. Essentially, you couldn't count absentee ballots until after the polls closed, which really slowed down their reporting. in that context, again, a lot of basically all of these bills are being pushed in the name of election integrity. The idea being that the specter being raised that there is a lot of fraud happening, and that we need to, do things to clamp down on that. As far as sort of the data that's out there, we certainly have a long American tradition of committing voter fraud, the 18th century or 19th century in particular. You see all kinds of shenanigans that happen, and certainly that leads to a lot of changes in how we do elections. As for fraud now, it's a relatively rare occurrence, or at least the prosecution of it, generally speaking, is. It's generally single-digit numbers of cases per state in terms of how many actual cases of fraud are committed, and a few of those are people voting people voting who are ineligible, or potentially people who impersonate someone else at the polls. Although that, in terms of numbers, is under 5 cases a state per election typically. So these are fairly rare sorts of occurrences. The absentee ballots sort of raise a slightly more interesting question, I think, in that regard. And as I said, I'm an absentee voter. I like the convenience of it. Certainly that said, it does potentially raise some concerns about who has access to the ballots, and under what conditions they're filled out, et cetera. The one kind of clearly documented case in this of kind of widespread fraud in absentee ballots was in North Carolina in a U.S. House race back in 2018. And there was someone hired by the Republican candidate who basically falsified several hundred absentee ballots. And in the end, it wasn't actually a decisive amount, but they had a rerun of the election anyway. And so certainly, as Professor Larimer said a minute ago, we want people to trust the integrity of elections. We absolutely want that as a standard. I suppose, just the concerns are sort of twofold, with kind of the laws nationwide, and they all, largely it's kind of these restrictions on drop boxes and who can turn in an absentee ballot, and things of that nature. The couple concerns I think that those would raise, one is just that convenience factor and the confusion factor. So, are we doing things that impede people's ballot access? And as Auditor Veeder was describing the Iowa bills, on the one hand, those windows are still pretty big. You certainly have a lot of time to turn a ballot back in. On the other hand, some of these changes, it's not entirely clear to me what difference that makes one way or the other in terms of actual stamping out fraud. I don't know that there's extra fraud more days out from the election or anything like that. I've certainly never seen any documentation of anything that looks like that. The other concern, of course, would be, potentially fairness in applications. Are these applied equally to all people, or are they deployed in a partisan manner? Again, on the face, these are bills that are neutral in a partisan fashion, but it does raise concerns, and I'll be interested to hear, and I already kind of know what Professor Larimer is going to say a little bit about the literature on, absentee ballots, but certainly, we want to make sure that these are things that are applied in fair ways and not to partisan advantage, one way or the other. With that, I think we'll go on to kind of some additional statements here. I think on the agenda here, Therese, you're up next. If you could kind of speak to, how these changes impact how the league does its work. Obviously, there are changes here about registration and absentee ballots, and that's something that you guys are involved with. So I turn it over to you.
Right. Thank you. Like I said earlier, one of the big important aspects of the work that the league does is the piece on education. And that's probably the part that's different for us this year. And so we're going to be working hard to make sure that the people in Iowa know the details on when, where, and how to vote this year. My guess is the typical Iowan doesn't really know that all of these changes have taken place. And so the league is going to work hard to make sure that the people in Iowa know exactly, about the when to request an absentee ballot, how long it's going to take them to get it, when it's going to be mailed, all those kinds of things that they have to do it themselves. They're not going to be mailed out by the county auditor. So education is probably the biggest thing. Tonight is a perfect example of what the leagues are doing in Iowa, holding a forum to educate the public. Around the state, there are leagues who are, as they're registering voters, they're already handing out literature, letting folks know about the changes. One of the great things they're passing out is this document that the auditor, Grant Veeder, mentioned earlier, that the state auditors put out. And so they're using this to educate voters. Some leagues are printing postcards. Some are inviting their county auditors to give presentations about the changes. They're using social media to inform voters. Whatever way they can to educate voters, that is what they're doing.
You would think after a year and a half on Zoom, I would remember to unmute. But anyhow, thank you, Therese. And I'll turn it over to Amy now for her perspective on this legislation.
Yeah, and I thanks, Justin. And just to piggyback on what Therese said, and what you said in summary, Justin, I think that's a really important point about confusion. I also work with a lot of organizations that work with people with disabilities, work with people, older Iowans, and it is very confusing when you look at how rapidly we've been making these changes. So just in 2015, Grant, when the earlier version of election integrity passed, I can't remember now, it seems,
2017.
No, the COVID year, 2017. With voter ID being required. And then there were a number of changes in that. There were voter verification numbers. There was a lot of changes that happened in that, and a lot of education that went out through, in partnership with the Secretary of State's office and with the county auditors, to educate people on those changes. They shortened the voting periods then. That was the first round of shortening. This is the second round of shortening. And so you mentioned the 29 days. Before that, it was 45 days. And yeah, so 40 days. And so, I mean, this is it's just a compounding effect on people. And these changes, when you have them happen so rapidly, people aren't going to really know for certain what they need to do. I think two of the biggest changes we talked about when we had those opportunities to speak. The one was the fact that you cannot have anybody else handle a ballot of yours that's not an immediate family member or someone that lives in your household. I mean, Iowa has a rich tradition of communities helping each other out, neighbors helping neighbors out in rural Iowa. So a snowstorm hits or something, or the neighbor comes by and says to the elderly neighbor, I'm going to run to the grocery store, or the post office, do you have anything you want me to take in for you? The person would be committing a serious misdemeanor for handing their ballot over and saying, go put this in the post office box. I know a lot of the victims' rights groups were really concerned because an immediate family member might be an abuser, and they might trust a friend to take their ballot in more than their own spouse. So there were a lot of concerns about that particular piece, which nobody had a very good argument for why we need to restrict that, other than the ballot harvesting that happened, that they called, from the political parties. Now, I personally would not give my ballot to somebody that's a campaign worker. I have trust issues in that area, but it is that person's choice. And that's what I consistently kept hearing, is you don't want to have these ballot harvestings happening. And, you know, I think it was an outsized change to that. The other concern that we had was really when you're looking at, by the time you can request it, when the ballot gets sent to you and when it has to be back in, make sure it's in, you know, there's not a lot of turnaround. You're talking week or 2 weeks to be able to turn those ballots around. And those, you know, the snowbirds may not have that, they may need to have more lead time if they're leaving the state. And so there was we brought up some of these concerns and thought we were going to have them addressed. And then in the end, the bill just really passed as it was. I think it was Senator Yoakum that's from Dubuque area that said they're creating an obstacle course for voters. And I think that might be the best way to talk about it, because it is, you're working around all these barriers to try to figure out how you're going to end up voting. And I don't know what the facts are. I'll look at Dr. Larimer for that, but I have heard that, you know, Republicans benefited just as much in some of the races as Democrats did with absentee ballots. And they particularly mentioned Randy Feenstra in his primary to defeat Congressman King. They had a very robust absentee ballot program. And so I think it was just a lot of people thought this was an overreaction. And I think that was our concern. We tried to be very practical with our changes and our requests for changes. And unfortunately, in the end, it just went through as it was originally drafted.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add, actually, kind of in response to both of those, one of my roles at UNI is actually working with voter registration as well. We're a campus that is a tremendously high turnout campus, in fact. And just sorry about that. Anyhow, neighbor kid wandered in. Very, very strange. So anyhow, but much to Teresa's point, you know, very much our role is educating, you know, because we are dealing with first-time voters, and that's, you know, a little different than some of the groups that you know, Amy highlighted. And I suppose the one advantage is whatever changes it is, you know, these are first-time voters, and so they don't know any different. We don't have to unlearn anything for them. But, you know, there is that challenge as things change, as we're, you know, training students to register people and offering up instructions and things like that. You know, as that environment changes, that does present, you know, sort of a series of complications as well. So I just wanted to echo that. Let's see, I believe next on the agenda was both Grant and Shelley, and we'll maybe just go in that order. If you guys could speak a little bit to sort of how this impacts how you guys end up doing your jobs, since you're the ones that actually have to run these things. You know, what do these changes, what implications do those have for your offices?
Well, the main one that concerns us here is the reduced time for turning around absentee ballots. And as we've pointed out a couple of times here, it used to be that we would start mailing absentees 29 days before the election, and then we would quit mailing them 10 days before the election for generals. So that's 19 days to turn it around. And as Amy said, it used to be a lot more than that. It was actually like 36 days before. Now we can't start mailing them until 20 days before the election, and we will quit mailing them 15 days before the election. So that 19 days is reduced to 5 days. Now, the law requires that we turn an absentee ballot around from the time we get the request to when we put it out in the mail in 24 hours. And if we're processing, you know, possibly 5,000 ballots a day, based on past experience, we're going to need more people working those days than we had in the past. And, you know, we have a very small election staff here. We have 3 people in that department, and other people in the office help out as they can with some of these during election time, but they are not trained especially for these very intricate duties. And so we try to get temporary employees that have done this work before, that we know that we can trust. So, you know, we want people that have experience doing this, that understand the process. And the more people that we need, the harder it will be to get people that have the optimum skills and experience. And then the more telescope the time, and the more relatively inexperienced staff that you use, the more challenging that it will be to avoid mistakes. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, Auditor Wolf, if you could weigh in with your comments, please. Thank you.
I echo what Grant said. That's going to be one of the big things, is if we have the same volume of absentee voters, we're going to be processing them all in 5 days, because there's only 5 days of actually mailing ballots. So I don't know if there'll just be less people voting through the mail, or if we're going to have a massive volume of work in that short amount of time. Another thing is the Dropbox requirement. I choose to have a Dropbox because voters use it a great deal. Excuse me. And I don't want to take that away from them. But then that means that my office has to go out there. My understanding is even on Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, 4 times a day, we have to check that Dropbox. And there's a camera on it, so it will be documented if we're not out there checking it, which we would anyway, but that's going to be a real hardship. Nobody lives in my office, nobody lives close to town, and 4 times a day is quite a few times to make a trip to town to do that. So we're going to, for the sake of the voters, because they utilize it. It's a very handy way for them to not have to worry about it going through the mail, what could possibly happen to it through the mail. They can avoid all of the delivery agent and the family member and all of that. Another thing along the lines of who can deliver a ballot, that's going to create some extra work for my office. There's tracking and documenting and work that goes along with making sure that that's compliant. Those are the big things. Some of it, I guess, we'll find out as we're doing it for the first time this fall, how it's going to affect our office, that things we maybe aren't even thinking of or realizing yet.
All right, thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Larimer from UNI, and if you could fill us in on some of that research. What do we know from political science about how modalities impact voting turnout, and what you think the potential here might be in terms of impact on what turnout looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And this really echoes what everyone has said. But a big part of this change is, as Grant said, we're with absentee ballots, right? So if you look at statewide elections, presidential years in Iowa, absentee ballot use was at 36% in 2008, it was up to 43% in 2012, 41% in 2016, and then up to 59% in 2020, right? So then if you have a bill that changes a lot of the procedures around absentee voting, there's a concern there about what that's going to mean for absentee voting. I want to say a couple things on this. I think one, as Justin said, why are we doing this, right? Was there a problem in terms of voter fraud? And so when a lot of the policy research out there's often a question about, is this a problem, or is this a solution searching for a problem, right? If there's not really a problem with voter fraud, what are we doing here? The other side of this is, there's been a lot of talk about the For the People Act in the US Congress, and the bill that's stalled in the US Senate right now about how to open up voting procedures. And some of the provisions there are about making sure that all states have same-day registration, that there's online registration, that there are more than 14 days of early voting, that there's a nonpartisan redistricting process. Well, those 4 things Iowa has all adopted already. So Iowa actually is in line with For the People Act. I think, and I alluded to this earlier, the concern is, right, if we know that being a voter in a previous election is kind of the #1 predictor of being a voter in future elections, the concern is that first experience, right? So if there's a lot of confusion, as Amy said, about all the changes that have gone into effect in 2017 and the last legislative session, and so you have a young voter, an 18 to 20-year-old, who shows up at the polls, and there's confusion about what needs to be presented when they show up at the ballot box, and there's, as Grant said, a concern about the experience of poll workers given all the changes. For that first-time voter, if he or she has a negative first experience, does that permanently shift that person's probability of being a high-frequency voter for the rest of their life to being less likely and more likely to be a low-frequency or an intermittent voter? I think that's the real concern there, because if you look at the research, as Justin mentioned, on absentee voting, there's been some recent research by some scholars looking at states where they've implemented vote by mail, where all elections in the state are adopting vote by mail, and they were looking at what is the effect on Democratic and Republican turnout when counties start to adopt vote by mail procedures, and they found that the effect is really negligible, right? So if there's a concern among one side that that an increase in the use of absentee ballots is somehow going to benefit one party, at least the existing research right now suggests that that's not really the case. So I think, it comes down to a perception issue, right? On the one hand, you could argue that what Iowa is doing, there are some, at least in terms of there's some alignment with For the People Act, but the larger concern is what is the first time experience for a first time voter if he or she goes into the polls and there's confusion, they don't have the right information, because we know how delicate it is to get someone to vote for that first time, right? It's hard to get people to do that. There have been a number of things that have been implemented over the years. Justin mentioned the motor voter law to ease the registration process, to try to ease the process of voting. But if you start to just create doubts, right, this comes down to a perception issue, not necessarily, part of it's a procedural issue, but also it's a perception issue. If you change some of this, then I think that's the concern. There's going to be an effect on turnout. And the last thing I'll say, and then turn it over to Justin, is some of this, we're still too early on the data. And maybe, Justin, this is something you and I and Donna need to work on. But, what would be really interesting is to go back in the last 2 to 3 election cycles and look at when voters, if they sent in their absentee ballots, when did they do that? And look at the type of voter that they are. So Grant mentioned, the change from 29 days down to 20 days. Well, what would be an easy study to do would be go back and look in 2008, 2012, and 2016. Who were the voters that sent in their ballots on days 22 through 21 through 29? Were those individuals people who routinely vote in both midterm and presidential elections? And if they are, chances are maybe they'll be still more likely to send in their absentee ballot, even though the number of days have changed. On the other hand, if those are people who are not regular voters, then there's a real concern that those are the folks who are going to be more likely to be affected by these changes in voting laws, and maybe less likely to vote because their normal time period for when they think about voting has been adjusted. So I think that's something that we need to think about.
Thank you, Chris. I had a quick follow-up from Grant. He was going to talk a little bit about processing military ballots. I know that's certainly a large constituency, an important constituency in terms of voting absentee, given their circumstances. So I wanted to give him an opportunity to weigh in on that.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry, for reminding me about that. When I said that ballots had to be into our office by 8 o'clock on election night, there are a couple of exceptions to that. If you are somebody who is in the military or a civilian living overseas, then we can receive the ballot by the way that it formerly was. We can receive it up to a week later, as long as it's before the the canvass conducted by the Board of Supervisors. And also participants in the Safe at Home program, which is for abused family members. They vote through the Secretary of State's office, and they also can have their ballots returned as long as they are postmarked before the election. And this is the same with military. They have to be postmarked before the election and received by the Monday after the election.
All right, thank you for that. So I think the next thing that we had here sort of on the agenda, and then we can maybe open it up for audience questions, but just to get some sort of general Q&A here on, what are the mechanics of voting sort of under the new system. So, one of these is, when do the polls close for the general election? And that's now 8 o'clock. Is that correct? I believe. I think we've covered a lot of these actually. So let me see. So I guess I'll just kind of read some of these off to Shelley, and she can answer them, and I'll ask the ones that we've covered just to have them all in one place, I suppose. So if you're registering to vote, how many days do you need to register in advance? And how would moving impact? Say if you moved in that window, what would that look like?
You're on the second question, right, Justin?
Yes. So you've got the list too, but I'll read them out so people know.
Yeah, as we talked earlier, it is 15 days, which changed from 10 or 11 days, depending on which election it was. So the voter registration timeline has changed. And this year, that date is October 18th to be pre-registered for the city school election.
Okay, thank you. And then people are still able to register at the polls. That has not changed, correct?
Correct. And Grant already talked about that.
Oh, talked about that, yes. Will the county auditor be sending absentee ballot request forms to all voters in the county?
No. If a person specifically requests an absentee ballot request form, we can send one, but we can't do that on our own accord. We have to be requested specifically to a specific person to send that to.
Okay. Will anyone be able to do large mailings of absentee ballot request forms to voters?
There are some groups that may still be able to. The Secretary of State will not be able to, like they did for the primary election, unless they are allowed to under certain circumstances, and county auditors are not able to. But there's private groups, other groups that do still send them, and I don't believe the law stops them from being able to do so.
Okay. When's the first day that I could request an absentee ballot by mail?
70 days before an election, and that for this election was August 24th. And hopefully this change, it shortens the window, but hopefully people remember that they requested and they don't duplicate their request and we don't get 2 or 3 from them. I'm trying to find the silver lining in some of these.
Let's see. If a person sends in their absentee ballot request form, when does the auditor mail them a ballot? So once they sent the request?
Within 24 hours. Typically, if we get it in the mail on a Tuesday, the ballot goes out in the mail on a Tuesday.
When is the first day that I can vote absentee in person at the auditor's office?
That is the same as the first day that we can mail ballots. It's 20 days before the election, which for this election this fall is October 13th.
Okay. And lastly, when is the last day that I can request an absentee ballot by mail?
That is 15 days before the election, same as the voter registration, pre-registration, and that's Monday, October 18th for this year's election.
Okay, thank you very much. So it appears so far that we have not gotten any audience questions, which was kind of the remainder of what was on the schedule. So I guess I don't know if we'd like to, if any of the panelists would like to ask questions of each other, or we have kind of space here for kind of a closing statement for everyone involved, and we can move to that if folks want to. I'm open-minded. Yeah, Sherry?
I'm still kind of struck by the idea that, I mean, officially, isn't the legislature out of session right now, or are they in session?
They're out of session right now. So they're in between the two general,
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So my point is, we're still in a pandemic. Things are getting bad. ICUs are filling up. And is there a provision? What does it take for them to change their minds about being able to send out safe? It's a dangerous time to ask people to stand in long lines and vote. So are there any provisions for voting during a pandemic if things are worse in November? I don't want to be a pessimist.
Would you like me to answer that, Jerry?
Sure.
The new law provides that the Secretary of State may send out absentee ballot request forms if there's a public health disaster declared by the governor, and if the legislature directs the Secretary of State to do so. So how that process is initiated, I guess it starts at the top with the governor declaring a public health disaster.
Okay.
And Sherry, I think how they did it in the past to get the legislature's approval, they did it through the Legislative Council, which is the members of the leadership of both parties in both chambers. So I think that would be the process again, if the governor declared another emergency, if the new variant proves to really be scary like it looks, and it takes hold. I think there are provisions in there that the governor could utilize. Sorry, my video keeps going off. Could utilize to get the council, and Secretary Pates had that relationship with the council. That's how he got permission to do other things in the last pandemic. They just wanted some check, I guess I would say. Check of the Secretary of State's office.
Yeah, Sherry, go ahead.
The second question would be about satellite voting. Do I understand correctly that satellite voting has been scaled back?
In a way it has, yes. The law now requires that any satellite that's established comes through the petition process from the public. It used to be that county auditors could, on their own hook, establish satellite locations wherever they thought would be worthwhile, and we've done that for many years. This is something that's it's practiced more in the larger counties than in the smaller counties, but and we would work with both parties to help to get them to determine what would be good locations. Sometimes we would get requests from either from political parties, usually from the parties, but it could just be from anybody from the public, where they would say, we think this would be a good location. Well, we've been doing this for 30 years. We know that in the past that it was not a good location. You're going to get 4 or 5 people there. So why not use this location? And we may still be able to have that kind of relationship, but it won't be our office establishing the locations. It'll have to come from a petition.
Is there information out there on how to do those petitions? Just thinking kind of with the UNI stuff, we've had really successful satellite voting at the Union and at the Dome and so on. What would I need to do to make that happen again? Just from purely selfish reasons.
My office can help you with that. We have information about that on our website, and it's on the Secretary of State's website, probably on Shelley's website, a lot of websites. So, but you know, just give us a call and we'll get you everything you need.
Perfect. Thanks. Other questions or comments or?
Well, I was going to ask Grant this question because it came up during the legislative discussion and Shelley, sorry, about the request for the satellite voting. The legislative leaders of the bills, the floor managers, were adamant that that was always the law, that they said auditors had not been following the law, that it specifically required the petitions. And then it kind of goes in, also tied into the 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock period, the shortening of that hours. They also said almost nobody showed up between that last hour, and that it wasn't a really big deal, and that they had heard from auditors that that was not a big deal. And it's kind of hard as an advocate at the Capitol to dispute when they say, well, somebody else said this without any real solid proof of that. It's hard to dispute it on the spot. So I didn't know if you had a reaction, either of you had a reaction to that.
I'll let you go first, Shelley.
The being open from 8 till 9 o'clock, we didn't have a lot of voters. I don't know the voters that we did have, that was based on necessity or more just that they had that opportunity. The consistency of always closing at 8 o'clock, because the city elections were done at 8, and then the next year the general election was done at 9, or in the fall, for a city election, you closed at 8, and then the following June, you have a primary and it closes at 9. I had a situation where I had poll worker confusion. So the consistency of closing at 8 o'clock, I think, is a good thing. We didn't see a lot of voters. And what was the first thing that you had brought up? Because I had something I was going to say about that.
The satellites, they had said that was always the law. Right.
And, you know, I looked at that when I heard that too, and it's an interpretation. It was, I felt it was an interpretation. The Secretary of State's handbook had guided us, saying that we could establish it, but, you know, so I don't think it was super clear in the law that it was maybe an interpretation. Grant might feel differently, but I did look at that and felt like it could be an interpretation thing. But we always were told by Secretary of State, and always felt like we could go ahead and establish them on our own.
I have no recollection of that argument taking place, and I didn't follow it that closely, so that's no surprise. But and it was over with, like you say, pretty quick. But I guess I need to go back and read how the old law stood. But if I just wonder why it needed to be amended if it already said that auditors couldn't establish satellite locations. And I thought it was pretty clear that auditors could, and I do want to reread the code on that. As far as the closing earlier for primaries and generals, it's true that the Auditors Association has supported that for many years. Not 100% of the Auditors Association. I've never supported it, but you know, that I'm not going to make a big deal out of it if the rest of the organization is in support of it. But even some of the people who supported it, after all these other changes were made that drastically reduced opportunities to vote, we're thinking, well, you know, we really didn't want to shorten voting hours under these circumstances.
Yeah. So Grant, I just wanted to add that the comment was made by the committee chair in the House at a subcommittee meeting the day it was introduced at 8:30 at night. So, and the virtual piece in the House, they're not allowed to have public comment from virtually. In the Senate this year, they were allowed to they were regular Zoom calls like this. So you could have interaction, but in the House, if you were joining virtually, you weren't allowed to say anything. So it really doesn't surprise me that many people didn't hear that argument, but it was voiced extremely strongly by the committee chair.
I'm going to
And
look it up right now.
I think Shelley is correct on it was an interpretation issue. I just wondered what you guys thought of that. So.
Anything else?
I have a question and a comment. My question is, who put Michael in a time machine? See what happened to Michael? And we need to give a lot of praise and kudos to Grant, that document that you were showing earlier, that's that voter education document. Yeah, Grant did that. That Grant put the work into that. We all reviewed and looked it over, but he did all that work and put quite a bit of time and energy and effort into that for all of us to use.
Thank you, Shelley. I do want to go back to the question of the satellites because I just looked it up, what's in the code. And this is what was removed. It used to say no more than 29 days before the date of the election, satellite absentee voting stations may be established throughout the cities and county at the direction of the commissioner. The commissioner, by definition here, is the county auditor. I'm not sure what is a difficult interpretation issue there. And, oh, I guess I see now. It says, and shall be established upon receipt of a petition signed by not less than 100 eligible voters. So is that and mean these are both circumstances that can occur, or does it mean they both must occur? I imagine that was the reason for the interpretation difficulty, but in practice, this had been going on since this bill passed in the 90s, I believe. So I'm not sure what the problem was with county auditors establishing satellites.
All right, any final questions or comments? Yeah, Sherry.
I wanted to say how much I appreciate the wisdom and perspective of everyone on the panel. And I really want to hearken back to your comment about that first impressions, first experience. When we were doing the voter registration at Hawkeye at Fall Fest, I had this very young woman come by and look at, we had this big poster with the QR code so you could click on it and go right to the DOT webpage and fill out this registration form. And my friend Marcia was there, and she was running around getting people to register and all kinds of things. So I'm sitting at the table, and this young lady comes up and looks at me very earnestly and says, well, I've never voted. I asked her if she wanted to register. And she said, well, they're just all a bunch of crooks. And my vote doesn't mean anything at all. And so I thought about it for a minute, and I thought of the rather infamous election we had that was decided by what, 7 votes? And so I told her that. I said, I think your vote does count, because remember, we just had an election between 2 women for a very important seat, and it was lost or won by 7 votes. And then she kind of looked at me and said, well, maybe I'll vote, but I still couldn't talk her into registering. And you just wonder, where do these people who haven't voted get all of their impressions and information from? And of course, it's parents, and it's social media and friends. But I just wanted to put that out there, that we really do have to watch when we're talking around young people, that we're enthusiastic about the nonpartisan aspect of voting. having a voice, making a choice, making a difference, and that we don't disillusion them or make them think, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with that. And thank you all.
All right. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank all of our panelists tonight for an excellent and informative discussion. And I'd also like to thank Sherry for organizing this. Appreciate all of your hard work coordinating this. It was a great opportunity, I think, to discuss these important issues. And with that, I think we can probably call it a night. Thank you very much, all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.